Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have Brian McVeigh back to talk about Julian Jaynes. As I've said repeatedly, Julian Jaynes has had a profound impact on my thinking in many, many, many different ways. Primarily, for me, it was understanding the value of writing and what it does for us, for you individually and in the society. What we've been doing in this series is we've been going through core concepts of Julian Jaynes, one by one, um, very steadily, so that these concepts are more accessible to everybody. A genius like uh, Julian Jaynes, what they are many, many, many decades ahead of their times. And what they do is that they take in everything and they try to integrate it all. So many people find it difficult. Many people who are used to focusing on this field or that field find it difficult to follow the lines of thought. So with help of Brian, we're trying to make these concepts accessible to everybody. That's what we are doing. If you have not already done so, watch the other two videos that we have, the entire series. We have a Julian Jaynes playlist in YouTube. Please watch that to catch up on the other concepts. So today we are talking about probably the culmination of the concepts, and that is the role of language in consciousness. All right. So Brian, are we ready to start?
Yes.
Wonderful. So Brian, let me just do a general thing first. So when you when you met Julian Jaynes, when was it?
The first time I met him was in 1985.
And did you start studying with him right away, or was it later on?
Well, actually, it's a little bit complicated because I was in the anthropology department and he was in the psychology department, and no one in my own department was helping me. So I went over to the psychology department because I remembered that somebody called Julian Jaynes had written a book years ago who looked at spirit possession, which was a topic of my dissertation. And Julian Jaynes was very welcoming, so we sat down. I told him what I wanted to do, and I think I've mentioned this before, but what surprised me about him, being a professor at Princeton, he let me do all the talking, and he was interested in what I had to say. So it was kind of a shock for me. But in any case, that's how I first met him.
Wonderful. Um, all right, so let's dive into this topic of language. So I think the best way to cover this is to just cover it chronologically. So let's look at our evolutionary heritage when we were living in tribes. So how did language come about? I mean, for example, if you look at other apes, their voice box is not that complex. So the range of sounds that they can produce is much narrower. This is an amazing instrument, and how much, just the range of sounds. So how did language start? Language in human beings start?
Well, actually, that's a good question. And my understanding is that there's a lot of debate and a lot of questions that researchers aren't really sure, but they make this assumption that it must have evolved gradually in Homo sapiens, maybe the past million, 1.5 million, 2 million years even. Not that Homo sapiens existed back then, but I mean, of course, our primate predecessors. But in any case, Jaynes takes a very different view, and his claim is that probably language, human language as we use it, did not appear on the scene maybe somewhere between 70 to 100,000 years ago. So most evolutionary psychologists don't like that idea. But the truth of the matter is we don't really know yet how language evolved among humans.
So according to Jaynes, before this time, before the 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, what was there before?
Probably there was a type of communication. Of course, we see this in present day primates, and it's more sophisticated than people think. Um, but if Jaynes is correct, the language, there's no need for it to be very sophisticated or evolved, because people, well, again, I used the word people loosely.
Mhm.
um, what who became people did not need a lot of things that we take for granted, and so language, even though it was probably a type of a sort of primitive type of language, was used to control the group, to keep people together. Because remember, whatever we were at that time, no doubt we were living in very small groups. So there was no need to have a sophisticated grammatical based language the way we do today.
Wonderful. I mean, the thing is that all of us, the entire ape family, our visual cortex is very large. And so we are able to actually, and we're talking about a troop where most people, most of the people in the troop are in sight. So there is a lot of processing that is going on, which is through body language, through gestures, and sound is just a kind of a side thing at this point. So when we start out with, in this time period of somewhere when what Julian Jaynes calls human language, what is that like at that time?
Well, Jane seems to think that language, and I noticed someone just put up this idea that language did not evolve, that it's an invention. And I think that's not a bad way to look at things. But to qualify, I would say that certain aspects of language certainly evolved, while at the same time, other aspects of language were a social cultural invention. And this invention, as I said, was not necessary until maybe, again, we're talking in approximates, maybe 45, 50,000 years ago, because there was, according to archaeologists, an explosion in human culture. The first signs of, they don't look sophisticated to us, but at the time, things like tools, primitive tools, started to appear, and probably that had something to do with the social invention of language.
Wonderful. So we have one data point about around 45 to 60,000 years ago. When is the next quantum jump as far as
Well,
language goes?
well, again, it's very difficult to say, but if we try to connect the dots, it could have been sometime before the agricultural revolution, so about 10, 12,000 years ago. Um, and probably somewhere between 10,000 to 45,000 years ago, there was a change in language where people started to hear hallucinations. And these hallucinations were not necessarily connected to ancestors or gods, who were way before that time. But these hallucinations were just a way for the human organism to remind itself to stay on a certain task. For example, how to carve something or how to dig something or whatever, because technologies were becoming more advanced. And then by around, again, no one really knows, we're just trying to connect the dots, but
Mhm.
maybe around 10,000 BCE, these hallucinations started to become associated with some sort of primitive religious entities, such as ancestors or gods. Actually, probably parents were involved. People, I
Mhm.
think, before we started to hear the voices of gods, we were hearing the voices of our parents and our leaders and our chiefs in these small groups. Again, this is a bit speculative, I'll admit, but it does follow a logic when we try to figure out how language evolved.
Okay, very good. I see. For me, the way I see it is that it's like in a troop, it's the alpha male telling people what to do. So it's basically the executive function of somebody telling you what to do in physical terms is being heard inside. So it's like a voice of your father telling you you should do that,
Right.
and then that hearing again and again, you are kind of internalizing it. And so it's like the executive part versus the doer part, and that seems like the executive part communicating to the doer part of what needs to be done. Does that is that reasonable?
Yes, and so what you're describing, of course, is what Jaynes called bicameral mentality,
Mhm.
where you had language regions of the right hemisphere, which are now, by the way, vestigial. They don't seem to have any function now, at least minimal function. But in any case, the linguistic regions of the right hemisphere would be communicating with the linguistic regions of the left hemisphere. That's the bicameral mind, two chambers. And um, and you know, I think you alluded to this point. So if you're living in a small troop, there are going to be times when you're going to be separated for whatever reason. Maybe you have to go out hunting and you're by yourself, but you are still going to need instructions. But if that leader or your father, your parent, whoever is not there, you still need to hear those voices. And that's basically why hallucinations evolved. It just became a more effective type of social management of the group.
Very good. I like the point about the distance. That you it's a way, language is a way of spanning the distance, of not having the person right next to you telling you. Initially they would just gesture and you would see from the gesture, so the sound was not used much. And then with the development of vocal ability as well as kind of complex organization, now you're using sound to describe things or what to do. You're hearing it, and then when you are away from that person, you are now kind of hearing it inside your head. So that looks like that's the kind of progression. And now we come to the stage of you're talking about early religions, where now we are not all living together in a small troop, but it's like a city, right? I mean, it's like 5,000 people. So how does language work in that context?
Well, so if we jump ahead by maybe around 3,000, 3,500 BCE, language actually takes a huge jump because now it is in certain societies being written down. And that really is a game changer. That changes everything. That's an introduction of a totally new technology. And of course, needless to say, it allows people to pick up language, as it were, when it's written down on a tablet or whatever, and move it around and to travel with it. And in some ways, that probably began the erosion of the bicameral mind. It gets a little bit complicated. But in any case, that's like I said. If we jump ahead to around 3000 BCE, this invention of the written word is very powerful. It was only limited to a small elite, of course, a very small scribal class. But nevertheless, it still had a huge impact.
So let's go back a little bit towards to the bicameral mind and the operation of the bicameral mind. So how would can you talk a little bit more about the bicameral mind itself? How would it actually work? What would people hear? How would they actually operate in their day-to-day life? Go ahead.
Well, probably people most of the time throughout the day did not hear any voices. Probably you would only hear a voice if you had a huge question, some sort of problem, you were uncertain as what to do. In fact, that parallels the way consciousness works in people today when we introspect. Most of the time throughout the day, we are not introspecting. There are a lot of good studies on that.
Mhm.
And so consciousness and hearing voices in many ways are more similar than we would assume. But in any case, so that's important to keep in mind that the voices were rare. It gets a little bit complicated because it also depends on who is hearing what voices. And of course, that's when social hierarchies come on the scene. And uh, probably what happened is you had different pyramids of voices. So you would have ancestor worship, and within a family, they would hear the voices of their ancestors. But then that little pyramid would be part of a larger pyramid, perhaps in a city state,
Mhm.
where the king or the leader would hear voices. And somehow these voices, I'm sure they did not always match up, but it didn't matter because in the minds of most people, the assumption was whatever the ancestors told me must align with what the king is being told by the gods. So in any case, it does get a little bit complex.
Now, James gives the example of Iliad as. Can you talk a little bit about how this appears in Iliad?
So Jaynes is interested in the Iliad because if you do a very careful translation of that early form of Greek, there are no mind words in it. That's the first datum. The second interesting thing is that the gods, both minor and major, play a very important role when it comes to directing human behavior. And people seem to engage with the gods in the same way that they engage with mortals. And of course, a lot of people assume, well, that's just a literary technique. But Jaynes thought a lot more was going on. And the reason why is because you find the same patterns in other ancient epics and other ancient texts. So the Iliad for Jaynes is just one example. And what he did is he looked at, in his search for words, for mental words in the Iliad, the closest thing he came up with were bodily organs and forces of nature. And if anyone's interested in this, of course, Jaynes, in a very readable, clear manner, describes this. And he lists about 7 or 8 key words that come close to what we would call psychological terms or mind words, but they're really not. So basically, what's striking about the Iliad is there's no language of psychology.
Yeah, it's very interesting, when he describes this in Iliad. So, for example, take the example of Achilles being very angry with Agamemnon, and trying to decide, should I kill him now or not? And the way in which he describes that is saying that you have, your blood is boiling, kind of impending you to action, and then there is this discomfort in your belly.
Yes.
And these two things in your body are there at the same time, and you're kind of torn between them. Physically you're in that state, and then suddenly Athena appears, and Athena says, go with this, go with one of these, do not kill him because of this. So that is the form in which, so it's like all of this kind of, the anger is shown in one way, the kind of impending doom or impending possibilities is seen in another way, and then kind of the process of making decision between them and making a decision is done in a third way through a god, something like that. Is
Yes.
that?
That's a very good description. And actually, what you're talking about, Jaynes makes the point that when a person would make a decision, they would have two physical sensations, not thoughts.
Yes.
That's very difficult, I think, for conscious people to get our minds around. But if you look at the text, that's what's going on.
And I mean, uh, one of the observations of Jaynes which really blew me away is the evolution of how the words referring to consciousness developed as metaphors from bodily action. So could you talk a little bit about that? The concepts of consciousness coming, starting as metaphors.
Right. So Jaynes tries to piece this all together, and he comes up with an evolution, we might say, or a chronology of metaphors. And I won't go into the weeds too much, but just very briefly, the first phase is what he calls objective. So that's terms used, what we would use for mental events, but originally they referred to simple external things and observations outside the person, not inside the person. Then the second stage is internal. Terms became associated with processes occurring within the body, such as internal physiological sensations. Bodily organs also began to represent places where, to our mind, cognitive, emotional, and volitional events would transpire. Then the third stage is subjective. Linguistic the words have moved from internal stimuli, supposedly causing actions, to internal spaces. So this is the birth of mental spatialization that we talked a lot about before. This assumption we make that we all have some sort of imaginary space, that we take it for granted, but it's actually one of the most powerful inventions, I think, of Homo sapiens, because it allows us to do so many things. But in any case, that's the third stage, is subjective. And then the final stage is, Jaynes refers to it as synthetic. All these terms come together, they unite into one conscious self capable of introspection. And so the different chambers of the mind become increasingly integrated, and it forms this space that, of course, we refer to as a mental space.
Okay, this is really important. So let's take time to kind of go through all these four, so that it's clear to them. So let's start with the objective. So can you describe the objective a little bit more? Can you give examples?
Yes, and I showed this before. I'll show it again. Hopefully, people can see it. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
The Japanese word ki, which can mean atmosphere, air, energy. Anyone who has done martial arts will be familiar with this term. If you know about Chinese medicine, this is a key concept. This is a good example of that objective phase, actually, that is still a vestige, not so much in Chinese, but very, very much in Japanese. In fact, I wrote an article about how important this word ki is. In any case, it evolved into modern Japanese, so it can mean spirit, feeling, mind, mood, anything. There are a couple of hundred examples of ki being used in Japanese, and just very briefly again. So in modern Japanese, it can ki atsu means atmospheric pressure, but then these other words here, uh, genki, vitality, spirit. So if you know Japanese, you say, "Oh, genki desu ka?" How is your vital? How is your fundamental energy doing? I don't. There's no good translation, but in any case, and then another example, ki ki omoi, which means to be depressed. That literally means to have a heavy ki. And then another example, ki ni yamu. So that's, of course, ki. And then yamu in Japanese means to become ill, to be sick. So when you say that you're worried or you're very sensitive to something, what they say is your ki, your vital energy, is worried. So, like I said, there are many, many examples in Japanese. And if we look carefully in all languages, we can find these different strata of these earlier ways of thinking. So, for example, psychology comes from psyche. As we know, psyche originally in early Greek meant air, breath, maybe even blood. And in fact, it's ki is very similar to the use of psyche.
Wonderful. So that okay, let's take some examples of the internal, of saying something internal being used.
Okay. Well, probably in the world's languages, the most common example is heart. Um, from what I've seen, almost all languages use heart metaphorically to describe psychological events. Probably that's because when we are feeling upset or angry or worried, often we have a physical sensation.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily in the heart, but perhaps around the heart. So I just throw that out there because to me, there must be a reason why so many languages use similar metaphors to describe psychological events. Um, there are clear-cut linguistic patterns that cross-cut all cultures, and heart is just an easy one that comes to mind.
Wonderful. Let's talk about the subjective phase. Can you talk a little bit more about the subjective phase? What?
So for Jaynes, subjective phase is when these sensations, or perhaps our blood or our heart or any other internal organ, in many cultures, they talk about your stomach or your liver, other bodily organs, as almost as if they have agency themselves. That when you act, it's not you, it's not your volition that's acting, it's your heart or your liver or your lungs making you do something. And again, we can find many vestiges, many examples of this in modern languages. But what's important, of course, is that there's been an evolution through time.
Okay. And synthetic is kind of fully conscious operation now.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
So I want to come at it from another angle, which I always find very productive, is to look at this developing in a child,
Mm-hmm.
because you kind of have to follow the same paths. It's kind of like the Evo Devo thing at a cultural level. You're kind of following the history through growth. So can you talk a little bit about how language develops in a child?
Well, that's a very important question. Actually, I don't know too much about that, except to say that you're probably right that it follows in each child a certain pattern. It's not as if obviously children are born with language, but more importantly, it's not as if children are born with a psychological terminology. That has to be learned. And the more they learn it, the more conscious they become in the Jaynesian sense. There are studies that look at what they call mental words or mental language of children. And like I said, I'm not very familiar with it. Perhaps another participant can comment on that. But I think we can make some fair predictions about how in a child mental language will develop, and they need this mental language in our modern society in order to develop this spatialization inside their heads where psychological events occur.
So let me again. I'm not, I've not studied it deeply, but this is what I understand as a general pattern. What happens is that, like, let's take anger, right? A child can get very angry, okay, and then there is really they don't have any word for it. It's just that they're experiencing something, and that's all they know, and that is actually going to lead to some kind of action. That's all they have. They do not have the concept of actually identifying. So, for example, the idea of saying, I am angry, is to say that there is a mental space, and in that me has a certain kind of emotion. So there is like already a distance from experiencing something and acting. Furthermore, they are, I mean, the big step is when they see that they can consider that they are angry. Another big step is they can actually see that there is a mental space in other person which
Right.
is different. So you
Right.
can say that, oh, and that they learn from parents, parents repeatedly saying, oh, I see that you're sad. So, or saying that, oh, don't be angry, take a pause. um, or oh, what you did makes me feel good. So then they are saying that this other person has a mental space in which thoughts, feelings, etc. happen, and I too have that, and that is different from my feeling itself, or my, so it's like it's a way of kind of achieving the distance from actual action into this mental space, which allows you to simulate, consider this. So, for example, you can say, a child who doesn't know language cannot say, I'm angry right now, but over time it will go away. Even though I'm angry, I shouldn't. They are not able to, for that, you need to be able to actually weigh things.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that mental space. And you need that mental space to do that. And that is what is learned from the parent over time. Uh, One step is just understanding that you have mental space. The second step is to understand that other people also have mental spaces. And so their ability of dealing with human beings, dealing with themselves, goes through the roof, because they are for the first time able to consider themselves, consider the alternatives, consider different ways of interacting with people and choose between them. And all of that is made possible by by creating this mental space inside their own head and understanding that there is such a thing with other people. And all of that is learned part of the culture.
Right. Right. In fact, I would put a twist on what you just said, that that learning of mental space, uh, what happens is the child begins to believe that other people have a space in their head before they do.
Mhm.
And so these words, these concepts are actually learned from the outside in. And I think the philosopher George Herbert Mead, I think was him, talked a bit about that. You know, how we assume that we learn from the inside out, but actually, probably we're learning from the outside in.
That's a great point. Great point. Thanks. But I think this actually, I mean, this is the best way of understanding what people in the past were like. You know, when you're talking about, 10,000 years ago, um, or even earlier, 45,000 years ago, or during the bicameral mind, it is during it's some phase in this childhood development that you're kind of looking back. That's the best way I have found of kind of understanding what does that mind look like. Okay, excellent. Let me see if there are any other things. Okay, there aren't kind of a major things that I have on my to-do list. What about you, Brian? What are the other points you would like to make about language?
Well, so if what we're claiming, what Jaynes claimed, is true, we should be able to show this scientifically. And the challenge is probably not as it's not as big as we may think. And what we should do, and I've tried to do this in some of my own research, is actually look at ancient languages, look at um, ancient text to see that if around 1000 BCE, give or take a few centuries depending on location, their languages were radically different. And uh, in fact, I've come up with sort of a fancy phrase for this. I call it the embryonic psycholexicon hypothesis. So it's a hypothesis. It's not proven yet, but I have collected some evidence. And so embryonic means that the language, these ancient languages, have not fully developed into what we would call mental language. And of course, psycholexicon just means mental language. Um, and what's important, the other interesting characteristic about languages before about 1000 BCE is that if they did have a word that described what we might call psychology, these words were always very concrete, very literal, very behavioralist. There's something, when it comes to nuance, there's something lacking. And like I said, I have not formally studied ancient languages, but I have exposed myself as much as possible to them. I have published on this, and I think there's something there. And the reason why I say this is because many people will argue that, well, we don't really know what people thought or what they were thinking thousands of years ago. And I think that's utterly untrue. We do have a pretty good idea. We get a good idea from archaeology, from historical text, and from the language. So in any case, what I'm trying to say is there is hope. There's a lot of hope there for showing that what Jaynes had to say was correct. And one more point about the embryonic psycholexicon hypothesis, which is that because these languages lacked mental words, what took the place of mental words was a very richly developed language for ancestors, spirits, gods, any term that we would refer to as being religious in association. And so the idea is the less words you have describing mental language, the more focus there will be on religious language. Because, of course, the idea is that the gods took the place of what we would call psychology.
Wonderful. So now the next thing the one major topic I want to talk to you about before we go, to Breakout Rooms is writing and what writing does to the mind. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think a good place to begin is the difference between orality and literacy, and I think many of us are very familiar with the work that's been done on that. Um, g- uh, People like Marshall McLuhan, but also people like Walter Ung
Mm-hmm.
uh, really investigated this, and of course they Walter Ung did not reach the same conclusions as Jaynes did, but what he showed is that the introduction of a new technology, writing, as we mentioned before, does change psychological processes. It may take a few generations, may take a few centuries, because as I said, only a small, limited elite could manipulate written languages. But the idea is that when you start to write things down, one change in human psychological processing is an increase in uh, a hypothetical way of looking at the world. Now you have a space. Now you have imagination, and you have to language. Written language allows us to come up with lists of words, glossaries, dictionaries. And in the ancient world, surprisingly, actually, they did begin to come up with what we might call glossaries, list of words. They would seem very uh, a little bit odd to us the way they categorize things. But the point is, writing is now allowing people to process information in a very different manner, and now they're gradually becoming more hypothetical, and now they're starting to question themselves. And we take language for granted, but anytime we talk about language, we have to be very careful. We have to make a division. Are we talking about the written word, or are we talking about the spoken heard word? Those are very, very different things, because as I said, the printed word changes the way we process information. And this, I think one way to put it, it actually increases um, mental space. It gives us more possibilities. It allows us more avenues to explore the world. So, in any case, in a nutshell, that's what I would say about the written word. And needless to say, by around 1500 with the Gutenberg Revolution and everything, that was another big explosion in technology. And of course, now we're living through another technological revolution, I suppose, with digital information, and this also is increasing our mind space. How it does that is very subtle. It's difficult to explain, but in any case, I think there is something going on there.
Let's go in two steps. So, one, I want to take time to describe what writing, what kind of internal experience I have with writing. I've been writing constantly. So ever since I was 18, I've kept journals and I incessantly write. So I have about 200, 250 journals. That's 40,000 pages,
Wow.
about 4 pages a day for the past 30 years, something like that. And what writing does to me, and in these meetups we have now instituted, now we've kind of made writing as a standard part of participating in the meetups. So it's a very big deal for me. What writing does, as far as I can see, is that it makes your thinking self-conscious, because when you write something, write a thought down, you're able to look at it externally. It's like externalizing your thinking, which enables you to look at it and say, did I get it right? Am I missing something? How does this connect to the other thing that I wrote? How do I bring all of these things together? What is the structure of it? um, you can look at it over time. So what that does is that it increases the self-consciousness. It allows you to think about your thinking. So it raises your awareness. It dramatically expands your ability to keep track of things. Otherwise, when you're thinking, you can focus on only few things at a given time. Writing, by putting it down in an organized fashion, you are able to put it down on a piece of paper and then look at that piece of paper, and that serves as kind of externalized memory, which you are using to increase processing of that material even further. So it is a dramatic, personally, I see it as a dramatic change, up to a point where if I'm reading, if I don't have a pen in the hand, I can't read, because I think I read in order to write, because that's how you actually understand something, of expressing it in your own way. Because until then, you're kind of watching TV. You're just kind of passively absorbing things. So that's why I think writing changes. And even if, there are two clear stages in writing. There is the scribal stage, where only few people could write. But because it was few, though it was a few people, the fact that they wrote had a profound impact on civilization, because they were the ones who were organizing the civilization, whether it was the people in the granaries of Sumeria who was keeping track of who was bringing in how much bushels of corn, or people, the priests who were trying to write the stories and, construct religion as guidance, which would now convert into kind of the as voices in the heads of people. And they had, like, though it was a small number, they had tremendous impact. But they needed that technology, advanced technology of writing, to be able to integrate such a large, complex human civilization. So that's how I see that stage. And because it kind of dramatically expands the self-consciousness. What do
Yeah.
you think?
Yes. Yeah. So when I used to teach, I used to tell my students, writing is thinking. If you want to figure something out, start writing it, and it'll eventually it will come to you. Um, and to get back to how you talked about the huge impact writing had, um, we actually, there are a lot of things probably about ancient scripts, ancient writings we don't know. Jaynes suggested that perhaps people hallucinated when they read, that they actually heard the text. Maybe depending on what the text was about, a hymn or a poem to a god, perhaps the god was talking to the person through the text. And clearly, in the case of hieroglyphics in Egypt, um, I, again, I don't know if there's evidence for this, but it's certainly a possibility that hieroglyphics spoke to people.
Mhm.
In fact, in many cases, when they would use hieroglyphics were not to be read by the average person. Hieroglyphics were, many times they would be inside a tomb. And the idea is that the hieroglyphics had what we would call a magical power. So writing for the ancient Egyptians, anyway, was not just about disseminating and conveying information. It was also about having a very powerful religious experience. And so, in any case, more research has to be done on that. But I think I think it's just another angle of the huge change that writing introduced into human societies.
Absolutely. So the last thing I want to say is that tomorrow, another student of Julian Jaynes, his last student, Mark Stahlbuck, is going to be here. Okay, and we will be talking exactly on this issue of different stages of civilization. He will be talking about, the oral civilization, then the scribe civilization, where very few people could write, print civilization, then the electric civilization, what happens when, TV, etc., become popular, and then the digital civilization. He is the president of the Center for Study of Digital Life, and he's one of the most profound thinkers I have met. So don't miss that tomorrow. It's at 12 o'clock Eastern time. All right. So folks, with this, we are now going to go into breakout rooms, and breakout rooms are going to last for only about for 20 minutes. I'm putting the rules for the breakout rooms in the chat in a moment here. Give me just a second. All right. So the rules are very simple. Hopefully all of you have been keeping notes and you know what are the most important things that you have thought of. So please, you start off the breakout rooms by giving 1 or 2 minutes for each person to put their thoughts on the table, and then you have a discussion. The rules are you keep on topic, be brief, be courteous, encourage others to speak, and if needed, click on ask for help. Jyoti, we are just discussing whatever ideas that you have written down, each person has written down. So that's where we're going to start the discussion. After the 20 minutes, we come back into this room, and which is where we begin the next phase, which is the most important phase, is you get to talk about your takeaways. Try to be brief, okay? Talk about your takeaways. You can also put a question on the table. And then Brian and I will address each of the takeaways and questions as we go on, and we'll go from there. All right, folks, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. We'll be back here in 20 minutes. So it's time for takeaways and questions. So you can either talk just about your takeaway, just put a question on the table, or you can do both. We have 4 rules. Number 1, and we've used these rules for past 5 years in our meetups. Rule number 1, type exclamation mark in chat when you want to speak or raise your hand in Zoom. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. All right, so you can go ahead and type exclamation mark to speak. Again, just like writing, by writing, you get a lot out of reading. By speaking, you get a lot out of listening. So, do speak and tell us what you think. Feel free to ask any questions. Brian, you take the question first. If I have something to add, I will go ahead and add. Okay.
Sure.
All right. David is first. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, since my buddy Joe isn't here, I'll have to go first.
Okay.
But anyway, Brian, wonderful, such insightful information.
Thank you.
A couple of things as an engineer, to me, I think one of the first things of language was planning. The cave drawing, you would have a splotch of blood or whatever on the wall of the cave and say, okay, when we, and there's only one word, food, whether it's alive or dead, that's what we're going after. And okay, Org, you go on that side and I'm going to be on this side, and Grog, you're going to be back here. And, we're planning. And I think this is, one of the first reasons. I mean, we got to learn how to cooperate to kill this animal. And the other comment I was going to make about only the elite having language or having reading and writing is the authority. Because it's mainly the priest, or as Shrikant was saying, the accountant, heaven forbid, the accountant, keeps track of the grain. So my gosh, he keeps track of the money. He's got a lot of power. And the priest, I mean, he can teach the people how to read and write, but as long as he's the only one, he's reading the Bible and he's interpreting, he's telling what's what, they have to come to him. And he has that parent authority. So any comments on that?
Yeah, so, well, to go back to the first point you made about language and planning, and it always amazes me when I watch working dogs herd, and or other animals working together. And I always wonder, to what degree are they planning? And there must be some basic element of planning. But I think with Homo sapiens, of course, planning became more sophisticated with earlier form of language that existed perhaps 45,000 BCE. But by the time you get to conscious language, that's when planning really takes off. That's when we're able to use a mental space to self-narratize, to project ourselves into the future, project ourselves into the past, to look at mistakes. And of course, writing really drives that. And I think I've mentioned this before, this idea of the future. I think it's important to keep in mind that the whole notion of progress, that it's almost like a religion in the modern world. We assume society should be getting better. Well, maybe not this past year, but the idea here is that idea is a new one, the notion of progress, that we can improve our social economic conditions. It's only about 200 years old. And I think this has to do with a relentless increase in consciousness that, of course, was triggered about 3,500, about 3,000 years ago. So to get to your second point about authority in writing, there's not much I can say. That's a very good point to make, that writing granted whoever had control over it, whoever had the use of it, tremendous power over any society. Economic power. They could keep. They knew what was in the storehouses. They could communicate with other elites. Basically they could guard any type of knowledge that they had. And I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, I was shocked to hear, I could be wrong, maybe someone knows, that even in the Roman Empire, when people were conscious, maps were considered a state secret, and you could get in serious trouble if you were found having a map. So in any case, that's a different type of writing, but thank you.
Wonderful. So I want to make two comments. One of the most fascinating things I heard about, kind of pre-writing stories is from Jacob Bronowski in his Ascent of Man. He talks about the cave paintings, and he makes a very simple observation that most of the cave paintings are very remote. They are not really where people live. They are way in a cave, which is quite inaccessible. And he asked why. And he had a very interesting explanation for it, a hypothesis for it. He says, what it was is that they were actually simulation chambers, planning chambers. So a person, when a boy got to an age where he could join the hunting party, he was taken to this cave, completely dark. And then suddenly light would be shown on this picture of a bear. And then the hunting. So basically the entire cave painting, the system of cave painting was designed as a simulation chamber to actually demonstrate what is involved in hunting. It was probably accompanied by stories and all of that. So that's a very interesting, so very much of a kind of a planning function, a preparatory function of what you would do in such a situation and what was important, what were the risks. It's a way of communicating that. Regarding the power of writing, yes, there is power in writing. So therefore, when printing press came along, things changed dramatically. Suddenly, a lot more people could read and write. And that changed. It was a completely different age. Similarly, with digital, a similar change has taken place. And we are still, most of us are still kind of thinking it is still the old times. They are not. They are not. Big things have changed. So that's, again, another plug for tomorrow. Come tomorrow to see actually what times we are living in. Because if you think that there was a change from writing to printing, something of that order of magnitude is happening or already has happened now that we are living in, which we are not even, most people, 99% or 99.9% of people are not even conscious of. So yes, this is very powerful stuff. And because we are living through it, we need to understand it. And only by understanding the history of it, what happened at each of these epochs, what happened when you moved from oral to scribal. Though it was a small number of people, look at the impact it had. Then with printing press, what it had. So that's what you have to trace. But great question, Dave. Thanks. Next up is going to be Jeff, Trevor, Mike, Jyoti, Jean, and Kevin. Jeff.
Thank you both for this conversation. I do think it's both foundational and really important. Brian, one thing you said, if I understood correctly, was that it feels to us that we learn from the inside out, but we probably actually learn more from the outside in. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think that's a fascinating notion that might be counterintuitive for many of us.
Yes, yeah. So what I said is that we learn from the outside in, and there's a sort of assumption that seems commonsensical that many of us make, that learning begins with the individual, and that we monitor our own reactions to the environment, and that we somehow keep track of what we're learning as we grow up. But the reality, I'm sure, is much more complicated than that, and we have to first posit, when it comes to consciousness, a mental space in another person before we believe or accept that there's this imaginary space in our own heads. Um, and that's just one example with mental space and consciousness, but I suspect that that's true for most things, especially when we're very young, that we're basically absorbing from the environment. We're not projecting out into the environment. Rather, the environment is projecting into us and gradually building our minds when we're young. That's a little bit vague, but hopefully that clarifies.
Brian, that is, I mean, that's a very profound point. I was wrong. I said, the child does that, but absolutely, when the parent keeps saying, look, I see that you are sad, or I'm happy. So you're trying to see, I was angry at you, but now I'm not. So all of that, it's like it's outside that is, that the child is observing, and then they project inside. Excellent point. Next up is Trevor. Trevor, you have excellent points. So go ahead and ask the question, even if it is lengthy. That's fine. It's a great question. So please ask. Go ahead.
Brian, can you see the chat? Because I think it'd be
you can just read it out so that everybody can hear it. Go ahead.
Okay, so the question is, do you think that the human ability for self-reflection, etc., might be significantly influenced by Daniel Kahneman's theory of System 1, subconscious, fast but unreliable, and System 2, conscious, slow but more reliable thinking, as described in Thinking Fast and Slow? The idea is that while it's true that an individual may in fact possess the ability for self-reflection in System 2 during abstract thinking, this ability is not always available depending on the specifics of the current cognitive task. For example, when people are arguing about politics, they're using fast System 1 thinking, and therefore they seem to be completely unaware of the well-known phenomenon of unavoidable and unperceived bias, logical fallacies, heuristic estimations perceived as facts, etc. And furthermore, our constant unawareness that this is the way it is, this is the nature of reality, always and everywhere. So if you go and look at online arguments, this phenomenon is always there, and it's the majority of discussion. Can this explain why humanity is literally unable to get its act together and pursue that which most people agree is the right thing to do?
Well, that's a big question.
I know.
And yes, I think there's definitely something you had to say. So when we talk about self-reflection, that probably has basically two meanings. One meaning is just to run a thought through your head and to think about something, where another meaning of self-reflection, or perhaps we can call it self-reflexivity, is a little more philosophical, a little more difficult to convey, but that's self-reflexivity is this sense you have that you are you, that no one else can ever have. It's a sense of selfness. And so the reason why I draw that distinction is because sometimes we use terms interchangeably. It gets a bit confusing on what we're trying to talk about. But to get to your larger point, you're using this distinction between System 1 and System 2. I mean, from a practical point of view, I have to agree. I think that there is not enough attention to self-reflection, as you put it. I think that, again, from a practical point of view, we have to figure out a way how to make people more self-reflective, to slow down and to examine very carefully what they're saying. I mean, in the world of psychotherapy and counseling, basically that's what it's all about, right? It's all about getting a person to look at things from the point of view of another person. And in order to do that, of course, one way is to, I hate to use the expression, but to raise their consciousness, or to introduce them to the fact that other people do have mental spaces that where different opinions dwell. And one way to become a better person is to figure out what those other perspectives are. Whether you like them or whether you agree with them or not, it's not the point. The point is to at least entertain the idea that we are all blessed with a very rich universe of different ideas. And some of those ideas may not be very useful, they may not be very good, but like I said, the whole point of counseling is to teach people to slow down and to somehow kick in that system 2 type of self-reflection.
Excellent. Trevor, that was a great question. I mean, the way I see it is that both these theories, both these views of Daniel Kahneman and Julian Jaynes actually mesh very well. System 1 is basically just stimulus response. And the way in which Jaynes would say is that inserting this, there's stimulus and response. So if you're just doing system 1, there is no mental space. You're just reacting to what is going on. The way in which you engage system 2 is to actually have a mental space where you're considering the stimulus before you respond. And so the equivalent of kind of creating of mental space in Julian Jaynes is engaging system 2. And it is slow, it is full of effort, and it is the glory of mankind. It is the thing that enables us to rise above our just automatic nature. It gives us the power of deliberation. It gives us the power of seeing possibilities. It gives us the power, as Brian was saying, of saying that there is a mental space, possibility of the mental space in the other person. And what does that mean? So you're not just reacting. Otherwise, it is two systems that are just going stimulus, response. And depending on where they are starting, it's impossible to resolve anything unless one or hopefully both the parties have this mental space or are engaging system 2. But great question. And that's the power of writing, folks. If you write out a great question, we can go into fine details and compare different theories very easily. Next up is going to be Mike and Jyoti. Mike, I'll give you 2 minutes if you keep on topic, 1 minute if you don't keep on topic. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. In the breakout sessions, and when you were talking, which we carried in the breakout sections, modalities of thought came into it. That some people think auditory, some people think visually, some people think in their gut. Like, I hear what you're saying, I see what you mean, I feel that you're right. Now, in talking to foreign people in a strange language which I never heard before, and they haven't heard me, gesturing can usually get your point across. What do you think that modality has to do with it? And also, I have a follow-up, if I may, after this.
Okay. Well, yeah, so modality of thought. This is I don't know if I can answer your question directly, but just let me make the point that we're familiar with perception, right? So vision, hearing, sight. But what Jaynes was talking about is what we might call quasi-perception, and how these lead to different modalities of thought. So when we talk about a visual modality of thought, an auditory modality of thought. We're really not talking about perception, probably. We're talking about the experience of for lack of a better term, a quasi-perception. And so again, I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, gestures. I mean, they're probably had something to do with the evolution of language going back, I would think, hundreds of thousands of years.
Okay, that was a great question, Mike. So you can go ahead and ask a follow-up, please.
Okay. A short follow-up first is some written languages are pictorial anyway, and the caveman that Mr. Shrikant presented is that kind of thing. The real question, though, is in my day job, I deal with AI and deep learning to some extent. The debate of whether consciousness would help machines is out there, and that is extended to the fact that would mankind be better off if we weren't conscious and we didn't have free will, but could rationally figure things out?
Well, that's a philosophical question that borders on the religious. So I'm a little bit hesitant to give my thoughts on that. What would it be like if we never socially evolved consciousness? I think life would be a lot easier because nobody would be aware that they were worried about anything. I think consciousness actually, despite all the wonderful things that it gives us, it's really in a sense a burden, because it made this one animal, human beings, grow up and not just become self-reflective, but become aware of their place in the universe. And I doubt any other creature has that awesome responsibility.
Yes, and I agree with Julian Jaynes that it's the greatest inheritance of mankind, cultural inheritance. So really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Jyoti, Jean, Kevin. Jyoti.
Yeah, hi. Great presentation, Brian. And it has a lot of relevance. Language has a lot of relevance in learning, reading, especially writing, and what have you. In my last life, I used to work with the children, and I noticed that when I went to the Head Start programs, their teachers would show them different emotions on the chart and have them play out. They will go in the circle time and they will clap, and they will be how it is like to be happy, sad, or what is the weather like, how is it making me sad, and what have you. So they had, before they got into the school system in kindergarten and first grade, they were advanced in expressing their emotions and writing them and acting them. As a result, they came out better readers than those who did not go to preschool or especially Head Start program. So definitely language plays a big role in learning to read and learning to write. In my practice, I was a school psychologist, and I had to go in the classrooms to observe the students and write notes about them, their behavior in the classroom, their interaction with the students, other students, and teachers. So I then had to do a psychological evaluation and put all the data together and bring out a great picture in front of the parent and the teachers. And a lot of teachers, they admitted they did not know the student as well as they knew now after they read the report, because they were not writing down, they were just saying, Johnny quiet, Johnny do this, Johnny do that, but they were not writing down their remarks or their comments. As a result, they could not put two and two together. So I would say that the writing has a great relevance, and I was able to talk about the student even when I didn't have the report in front of me, because I had written down all those points. So now that in our breakout room, we started to talk about how we can make our ideas more meaningful when we write them up. But my thing is this, we don't have the luxury of time to put down all the, especially at my retired age when I got so many other responsibilities other than just making meaning of what I have read and what I have said. So how do we do that? How do people like me, make my retirement even more sharper than what used to be when I was working through the writing skills? And I still have the writing skills. And Shrikant, you have to give me a cookie, because before you told everybody else to have a paper and pencil, I already had the paper and pencil. I need my cookie.
Yeah.
So this is my question.
Okay, the next Zoom update, we are going to be able to deliver cookies through. So that's the next technology, being able to deliver cookies.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, so this is actually what you commented on, I think is very important, very exciting, because this shows us the practical side of what we're talking about. Just a comment on what you seem to be talking about is teaching young people emotional literacy, emotional intelligence. And as you know, it's very difficult to teach anybody anything if emotionally they're not doing well that day or they're upset about something. And so, the idea traditionally in psychology, there are two sides to a person, the intelligent side and the emotional side. And for many decades, psychologists would really look down on the emotional side. And it really hasn't only been maybe the past several decades that we have started to take the emotional side more seriously, with a lot of talk of things like emotional intelligence. So that's the first thing I'd say. And then, how do we keep this up as we get older? I said a little earlier that when I'm counseling, I always feel strange giving an adult a list of emotion words. And I have these lists, I don't know, maybe there's like 50 to 75 words on them to describe different sentiments and feelings. But even with myself, I always find it useful if I'm writing something to go back and to look at these lists, even though I know the words. But what's important is not whether you know the word, but are you going to use the word in a context? Has a context called up when you're writing something where you should be using a more precise or more subtle expression? So in any case, that's not terribly profound advice, but what you're talking about, I think, is very important. And I think with writing, I think sometimes when we're students, we associate writing with something we have to do, with some sort of almost a burden. And I think it's good, and some of us do this, I'm sure, to just write for the sake of writing and don't worry about an audience. Don't worry about the purpose or the reason for your writing. Just write. And you'll see, of course, that there's a lot going on inside our minds.
Next up is Jean, Kevin, Stefan, and Jennifer. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So I think writing is directly related to printing, because in the past, when we have the printing, then newspaper is the main source of communication. That's why writing is so important, and books. But recently I joined some meetings, small business meetings. I meet a lot of young people, and I found also in Instagram, I found people just communicate differently right now. Like this young people who are doing the personal coach, they're actually using all these different tools, and they're doing yoga with all this visual. They have all these tools they're talking about. And in Instagram too, I saw, and they were like doing this, even the book review, they were use quick videos, starting to do that. And somebody mentioned, when you write on website or blog, whatever, when you write a long article, nobody read. You have to write super short. So I just wonder how that actually affect. I think the younger, my son too, I enjoy reading book more and more, but I found the younger people, they don't really have time or the mental space or to do all that. I just wonder how that affects the younger generation. It seems people have shorter and shorter time to read anything, or they even do more than multimedia type instead of. So just want to hear your thought on that.
Well, again, that's a fascinating question. It's a very big question. I mean, we hear a lot about that younger people are more used to things that are presented to them visually, and they have a more difficult time reading, or probably they have less patience to read. How true that is in any given population, of course, I don't know. I think if it is true, I think it's unfortunate, because I do think that old-fashioned reading, for lack of a better expression, does recruit certain parts of our mind. It does demand a certain psychological labor that is very, very useful. I mean, we can't go through life just looking at pretty pictures all the time, right? Homo sapiens has developed different modes of information for different purposes, for different reasons, whether it's writing or something more visual, something auditory, and all those different modalities exercise certain parts of our brain, and I think we have to pay attention to employing all of them. It's not much of an answer, I suppose, but the other point I would make related to this is I do think we are undergoing a change with the way we process information, and I do think it is more visual. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's debatable. But I think we are more used to, we all know this, doing things on screens. We're more used to looking at pics and images. And what this will do to our cognition, of course, it's too early to tell. But I'm sure a century or two from now, we will see some changes.
Okay, Gene, that's a fantastic question. And that's exactly what we'll be discussing tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Basically, what happens is that after television, especially after television, things change. The way in which people process information changes. Again, with internet, with the technology, the way in which people process information changes. And how exactly the mind operates differently in a print medium, because we're not just talking about how one particular person is doing it. We're talking about the culture as a whole and what kind of mode of thinking and of interaction that is developing amongst people. So both internally and externally. And that's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. We're going to be talking about these different stages. So for example, writing was a big factor even before printing in the scribal period. There are very few people doing it, but that had a profound impact on civilization. Then there was printing, then there is kind of the electric or kind of television age, and now there is the internet age. And that's what we're going to be discussing about tomorrow. So stay tuned. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead. Kevin, Stefan, and Jennifer. Kevin.
Early on, Brian said the language don't need sophisticated. I agree with that. Our modern language and culture try, deductive, specialized, specific, divided. Try, it's advantage. We can learn very specific, find the difference. However, it's going to confusing. The cause that people need to try transform those meanings internally, externally. How about do you agree with that? We may need lateral learning, like a parallel, try and match those words from, for example, for transdisciplinary possible, they use a similar structure or similar language to try describe. Furthermore, it's computer only understand language so in 0 or 1. Even we build, on top of different language. How about our brain? You mentioned the 2 words. One is chi, another is heart. It's obviously universal. Obviously have some metaphor, and not 100%, but mostly. I got 2 words for you. What have you do research for that? One is organ, another is operate. For organ, if we search meaning, originally it's from instrument of music. It's like a piano. Can I do hypothesis? Let's see, could be a language from sound of nature or music. Operator is interested too. We use masked operator. If you see operator from other workers or something active action, we have that. However, in dictionary, they don't specific mathematically operators speak another chunk of, let's say, minus plus. What's your thought? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I was a little unclear. Could you just very briefly ask the specific question again?
Okay. Question. Let's see. The first one. Do you have research for about the two words, operator and organization? For example, we use the metaphor too. It's from Western style.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, the heart is one of the organ. It's manage our blood, the pump all blood to all over. It's if furthermore metaphor. How about a leaf? If you see leaf, this is like a blood vessel. Even further, Amazon. Yeah, I'm going to stop. I guess
No,
Okay.
Kevin, you have to keep it very short. Go ahead. Brian, did you get the question?
I think so. So you're asking Kevin. You're asking,
let's use same metaphor. You use the metaphor under the chi and the heart.
right.
How about these another two words? I would say very interesting, the organ and operator. This was original, how far you can know.
Right.
Let's see backward, the BCE time or something. Let's see, very interesting. Organ is original from the music of the instrument.
Yes.
What's that connection? It's make us thinking.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Well, so of course the heart was not the only organ. It's the most common organ that languages use metaphorically. There are other organs. The brain or the head, actually, it's not an organ, I guess, but we use the head, the chest, even the blood itself has been used metaphorically. And the definitions of these metaphors have changed throughout time. I'm a little unclear on the second word.
Let's skip it. Let's go to the next. Kevin, please be very concise next time, okay? So we can get to the questions. Next up is going to be Stefan, followed by Jennifer. Stefan.
Yes, I was curious. So I found this study that said that if you write down your goals, you're a lot more likely to accomplish them. I was wondering, why is that?
Well, I think, to put it simply, because you're taking something from inside your head, and let's face it, things that are inside our head are very vague, cloudy, unclear, and we're making it real. We're making it physical. We're putting it into the three-dimensional world. That gives our thoughts a type of power, almost a type of magic, if you will. I think that's one reason. And so somehow it becomes more real when things are written down. The other reason is because when you write down your goals, it's almost like you're making a contract between yourself. You're putting a little more pressure on yourself. You're raising the expectations that you have for yourself. So there could be a sort of a psychological trick there. Why writing something down makes it more convincing and more persuasive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find this to be extremely useful. So firstly, it is that you think about it more when you're writing it down. But more importantly, typically anything that is important to me, I put it in a place where I actually see it again and again. So it's a way of kind of putting it out there and then putting it back into your mental consciousness, in a mental space. And so that you are always focused on it. It helps you. It's like an external tool to keep focused on your goal in your mental space. So that's why it is a way of kind of expanding the emphasis on it. And that's why I think it helps. Next up is Jennifer. Jennifer, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm trying to get my video back on. There we go. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is, and this goes along with the discussion that we're going to be having tomorrow. We talked a little bit in our group about this sort of psychosomatic connection between note-taking writing concepts down and then took it kind of one step further. And when I take notes, there's almost this very visceral connection between the language that I put on the paper and the way that I have organized the material organized in my head. So I think about things like my notes almost help me make a mental map of the information I'm learning. I'm wondering if at all how this might tie in. And then I also have some issues with online learning. I'm an editor, and sometimes I get guidelines in video format rather than written format, which I can't operate that way. So then that ties over into tomorrow's conversation. But Brian, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on either of those comments. Thank you.
Well, yes, that's an important example you pointed out. And very briefly, what I would say is that this shows us how powerful the role of mental space is and images we can see. Even if we are not looking at an image in our head, if our mind's eye is not focused on an image, the very belief that we have mental space is very powerful in itself. And so when we write something down, chances are, I know I do this myself, I actually do see it more clear in my own head. I'm able to visualize it. So this shows us how something that seems very easy to do, very practical, actually has profound implications for how we process knowledge. And I think I've said this before, well, I guess maybe we'll talk about it tomorrow, but I just have to say, as we go forward in the future because of technology, I think our ability to visualize in our head is going to become stronger.
I just want to add one thing to it. I think you need to use a lot of strategies for writing. So for example, for people keeping notes, using pen and paper for this meetup, what I recommend is to have one sheet of paper where you have like summary of everything. So this is kind of like mind map. And then you keep notes everywhere. So it's like I always like to kind of capture everything that I really need to pay attention to on a single sheet of paper. So it can be seen in one glance. And there can be notes elsewhere to kind of do an elaboration. So this is the same concept of mind map. I find it extremely useful of trying to keep all the interrelations and all the values, all the important things I think are valuable in just one place and be able to kind of visually process it and to kind of see interrelationships between them. So definitely. All right. So let's look forward. So next time, we're going to be talking about, Brian, you're going to be talking about how to apply Julian Jaynes' ideas to your life. Can you tell people a little bit more about that?
Well, what I'm doing now is I'm working on a book project on how to elaborate upon Julian Jaynes' ideas about consciousness in the world of psychotherapy and counseling, and how consciousness, to my mind, is actually an active ingredient, we might say, or can be used as an active ingredient for how the mind heals itself. So it's a little bit abstract, but in any case, I think there's a lot of potential there. I think there's a lot of practical applications for Julian Jaynes, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface.
So folks, that's what we're going to be talking about next Saturday at 12 o'clock. So don't miss that. And we're going to, I think this series is working very well. I think people are, we've seen the responses to people both in breakout rooms as well as, in the takeaways and questions. And I think people are able to follow these ideas, get these ideas. And these ideas, the way I see them, is these are just starting points. Because if you understand what these tools do for you, the biggest payoff from it is to realize that tools are changing, have changed dramatically. And what does it mean today? So it's like most people are watching TV as if they were just sitting at the campfire. Most people are using internet, in a very passive way. They are just surfing. Okay, that's not really making use of what is there. And there are a whole bunch of people who are using it in a completely different way, which is actually transforming our lives. And that's what, that's what is the real payoff if you understand the principles of what media does for it. So, so there are some great thinkers on this. There is Marshall McLuhan, who Bill was, gracious enough to tell me about, and I've been following up on that. Bill, could you say a couple of words about Marshall McLuhan?
Sure, and again, I'm a student here, and coming up to speed on much of this myself. But his observation goes back to a saying that stuck very much in my mind, and is certainly true in the world of science and engineering I come from, since I'm not a person of letters, and that is that first we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. And that's a very, very powerful idea. And in McLuhan's case, he applied that to our mentality, our consciousness. I've seen it happen in my career and in the way we approach science and engineering and technology and biotech. He played that into how it affects our mind, how our communications tools, the means with which we get information from one place to another, how we shape that first. We invent language, we invent writing, we invent printing, we invent the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, and the television, and what that has done to our minds. He's the most profound observer and thinker about that. And again, I'm just myself learning about it and putting it together with Jaynes. I don't think anyone has done much before until Stallman came along.
Yep.
And I'm watching Stallman put together Jaynes and McLuhan and Aristotle and Aquinas, and my head is exploding, right? And so again, I'm along for the ride here, and I followed the Jaynes breadcrumb trail, tracking Brian. I got on Brian's trail. I read his books. I'm comic guy, and I'm following, and I followed him to you, and then it's just the breadcrumb trail, right? And then it's connecting you with Mark, because these ideas need to have sex. Ideas need to mate and blend, and you see what comes out. And if there's a missing piece, and McLuhan seems to have been missing from a lot of people's thoughts, you cannot put together what's happening to us right now if you don't have all these threads. That's why I find this so exciting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. So folks, don't miss tomorrow at 12 o'clock.